Welcome to Your Soul Rising. In this video, I lecture about the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius and discuss how it remains so relevant to us today. Subscribe to the channel if you are new, and be sure to check out the full lecture series on the book if you haven't already. You don't have to have seen all of those videos prior to this one, but of course, I recommend the full series if you enjoy this lecture. If you've already completed the lecture series, you can think of this video as the capstone lecture on the Consolation of Philosophy. So as always, get cozy, grab a blanket, a warm drink, and enjoy the fireplace sounds in the background. Let's begin with the condition of the modern soul. We live in a world where almost everything we do, create, desire, or believe is filtered through the lens of the material. Not just in science or economics, but in the very atmosphere we breathe. Our education, entertainment, and even spirituality have become hollowed out, distracted, turned toward the immediate, the surface, and the measurable. We're taught, implicitly if not explicitly, that what is real must be what is physical, that what is true must be what can be verified in a lab or sold in a marketplace, that what is meaningful, well, that word doesn't even really have a fixed definition anymore. It's whatever feels right, whatever works, whatever distracts you from the gnawing silence just beneath the screen. And what has this done to us? We have soaring rates of depression, anxiety, addiction, disconnection. We have a mental health epidemic not just because of trauma, although that's certainly part of it, but because we've cut the human spirit off from its root. We are starving in the midst of plenty. We scroll endlessly for stimulation because we have forgotten how to dwell in meaning. We chase ideologies, identities, and systems that promise transcendence, but they're built on foundations of sand. And when they inevitably collapse, as they always do, we are left angry, afraid, confused, and unmoored. We see it in our politics, in our polarization, in the ecological devastation that we now treat as normal. But these are not separate crises. They are symptoms of the same thing, that we no longer know what reality is. Because we no longer know what the transcendent is, or even acknowledge that it's a thing at all. It's not just that we've denied the transcendent, it's that we've forgotten how to even conceive of it. When people speak today of the divine, or the eternal, or the good, they are often met with polite confusion at best, or cynical derision at worst. But beneath that, I believe, is longing, a sacred ache, an unspoken sense that something essential is missing, that the center has not held, and that we are lost, that our maps are drawn in chalk on a crumbling wall. And that's why I believe the Consolation of Philosophy matters so much right now, because it comes from a voice who lived through the same collapse. Boethius is not writing from comfort or power or intellectual abstraction. He is writing from a prison cell, stripped of everything the world told him would make him happy: status and wealth, reputation. He finds himself completely exposed to the question, what is real? What is good? What is unshakable? And in those questions, he receives a visitor. Not a god, and not a priest, not a political rescuer, but philosophy herself. A woman robed in wisdom, eyes radiant with memory, who does not speak platitudes, but rather guides his soul, gently and firmly, back to the ground of reality. And that ground, as we'll see, is the transcendent. Not something out there in the sky, but something beyond the fluctuations of time, beneath shiftings of circumstance, and within the very core of our nature. This is what our world needs. Not a new ideology, not another app or breakthrough or trend. A reawakening to the transcendent, to that which cannot be reduced, cannot be bought, cannot be marketed or weaponized or commodified. That which simply is, and always was, and forever will be. That which unites truth, beauty, goodness, and love, not as separate virtues, but as a single radiant source. This is the beginning of consolation, and it's not comfort and it's not distraction, but it is the slow return of the soul to the eternal. So let's now turn to Boethius himself. We meet him in ruin. Once a man of immense stature, as a philosopher, statesman, a guardian of justice under a fading Roman order, he has been stripped of all titles, betrayed by those he served, and condemned by the very system he upheld. And now, alone in a prison cell, he is left with nothing but the silence of his own thoughts. And this is where we begin to recognize him, not as a distant figure of antiquity, but as us. Because we, too, are living through the collapse of an order. Ours is not the empire of marble and law, although it certainly pretends to be. Rather, what's crumbling is the invisible empire of meaning, as we have known it. For centuries, our civilization was held together by a story, however fractured and imperfect, that placed the human being within a cosmos of purpose. There was a sense of origin, direction, and destiny. But that story has unraveled, and with its unraveling, many of us have found ourselves in a kind of spiritual exile. Boethius, in his cell, faces the same exile. He is no longer surrounded by the structures that once told him who he was, and neither are we. The structures we once trusted, institutions, traditions, even language itself, have become unstable. We don't know who to believe. We don't know what to value. We don't know how to tell right from wrong without slipping into either nihilism or relativism. The soul is disoriented. And just like Boethius, we try to make sense of the world through whatever fragments we have left. But the answers don't come. So Boethius begins, like many of us, by lamenting the injustice of it all. Why do the wicked thrive, he asks. Why are the good punished, while the corrupt grow rich? He doesn't just mean materially, he means existentially. Why does life seem to reward falsehood and punish virtue? Why does meaning collapse when it's most needed? Why does the world feel like a betrayal of everything the soul was promised? Of course, these are not just philosophical questions. They are the ache of our time, perhaps of all times. Because today, we too feel this inversion. We feel it when we see cruelty rewarded and compassion ignored, when we see superficiality elevated and depth dismissed, when we try to live authentically, but the world offers no recognition, no reflection, no shared language for what we're even trying to do. And so many, especially those who feel things deeply, turn to despair or numbness or distraction because to stay awake in this world can feel unbearable. And yet it's precisely here, in this place of disorientation, that something sacred happens. Boethius doesn't find consolation in success or escape. He finds it when Lady Philosophy enters, when the soul turns not outward for validation, but inward and upward for truth, when the question itself becomes the path. His suffering is never denied, but it's transformed into the very opening through which the transcendent can return. And isn't this what we long for too? Not easy answers, but a reawakening. Wisdom. Not external validation, but an inner clarity so radiant the world's false measures lose their hold. Boethius shows us that collapse is not the end, but rather an invitation. He becomes the archetype of the soul in the modern age, cut off from the surface, cast out from the old systems, and yet poised to rediscover the eternal. And what he rediscovers, as we'll explore, is not just an idea or belief, but the very structure of reality itself, the transcendent that holds all things, including suffering, in an unshakable harmony. And so the question echoes in the stillness of Boethius's cell. What remains when everything else has fallen away? That's when she appears. Not in a blaze of glory or a heavenly vision, but with a calm authority that silences confusion. She is tall and regal, worn but luminous. Her robe is torn by neglect, her symbols faded by the passage of an age that no longer honors wisdom, and yet she radiates a power more enduring than empires. This is Lady Philosophy, not just a personification of logic or cleverness or intellectual games, but the ancient soul of wisdom herself. She is the guardian of memory, the healer of the fragmented self. She is the midwife of the soul's return to the transcendent. When she enters, she does not offer Boethius flattery or pity, escape, distraction, stimulation. She drives out these false muses who had been feeding his sorrow, those whispering voices of self-pity and grievance and despair. She clears the space so that something real can emerge. And then she begins, not with answers, but with a diagnosis. You have forgotten what you are, she tells him. That is the root of the pain. And isn't that what she would say to us? We, too, are drowning in the noise of the world, surrounded by entertainment, scrolling through tragedies, inflamed by ideology, soothed by consumption, and yet always, always returning to a low background hum of hollowness. The soul knows it has been exiled, and what Lady Philosophy does for Boethius, she would do for us. That is, remind us that what we've lost is not political power or reputation or even stability, but our relation to the transcendent. That which is beyond the wheel of fortune, beyond time, beyond death, beyond the opposites of every duality, beyond the endless cycling of gain and loss and pleasure and pain and pride and humiliation. That which is not subject to change, and therefore is the only foundation for peace. And the miracle is this: she does not present the transcendent as something out there, some unreachable place in the heavens. She shows him that it is already within him, hidden like a buried light beneath the rubble of false beliefs. She teaches him that the human soul always remains rooted in the transcendent, even when it forgets, even when it suffers, even when it is surrounded by darkness. She reminds him that truth is not invented, it is remembered, that the good is not a construct, but the source of being, that the transcendent is not a fantasy, but the most real thing there is. And this is why her presence changes everything. She does not console Boethius by removing his pain. Rather, she reveals that pain does not define reality. She does not undo his prison sentence, but she opens his mind to the truth that even within prison, the soul is free. She does not promise him safety, but offers something infinitely better: the return to that which no circumstance can touch. The transcendent, as she reveals, is not cold, not abstract, not separate. It is absolute unity, absolute love, absolute knowledge, and absolute meaning. It is the place where all opposites reconcile, where sorrow and joy are no longer in tension because both are contained in the boundless radiance of being itself. And once Boethius remembers this, once he begins to see, not with the eyes of the flesh, but with the eye of the soul, he begins to change. He becomes still, grounded. His complaints fade. His questions become deeper. His peace is no longer dependent on material outcomes. He is awakening to something that can no longer be taken from him. And this is what philosophy gives. When she lifts Boethius out of the shadows of despair, she doesn't lead him into a new ideology or a political solution. She doesn't promise that justice will be served in this world, or that the wicked will fall, or that his freedom will be restored. What she gives him is far more powerful. She returns his vision to the transcendent. And what he rediscovers there is no less than reality itself. He begins to see that the good he had once studied and served, believed in, is not just an abstract ideal or a set of moral principles. It is the source, the wellspring of all being, all beauty, all meaning. The good is not a part of reality. It is reality. It is what holds all things together. It is what every desire ultimately yearns for. This is the first great rediscovery, that all things move toward the good. Even when we are lost in confusion, even when we chase pleasure or power or fame, we are really reaching for something permanent, something true, something whole. Every false path is a distorted expression of a holy longing. So Boethius begins to understand that longing is not a flaw in the human spirit, but rather the very compass. The ache for fulfillment is a memory of something we once knew, something we came from, something we still, somewhere deep inside, belong to. Lady Philosophy names it clearly. God is the good, and the good is the transcendent center of all things. This is not some distant deity or a sky tyrant, but that which is beyond all things, within all things. That which is unchanging, yet gives rise to all motion. That which is not part of time, but gives time its rhythm. The one, the source, the absolute. That which is transcendent and immanent. Boethius sees that all created things like wealth and honor, pleasure and knowledge, are merely rays of this singular light. And when we mistake the rays for the sun, we suffer. Because nothing finite can satisfy the soul's infinite hunger. Nothing temporal can ground a being who is made for eternity. But when we turn back, not outward, but inward and upward, then the longing begins to make sense. Then we understand why we were restless, and why the restlessness was not a problem so much as a summons. In the classical language of the soul, Boethius rediscovers 4 divine attributes that flow from the transcendent good: unity, knowledge, and meaning. Unity, because the transcendent is one. It gathers all diversity without erasing it. It reconciles opposites without reducing them. It is the end of fragmentation, the still point in the turning world. Love, because the transcendent is not indifferent. It draws all things to itself. It is the binding force of creation and the desire of every heart, the center of every orbit, the warmth that holds the stars in their dance. I personally love John Vervaeke's definition of love as a reciprocal opening. In a normative context, that means 2 people reciprocally open to each other. But in the case of the absolute, divine love is reciprocal opening into absolute unity. Knowledge, because the transcendent is intelligible. Not in the way a formula is intelligible, but in the way a face is. The soul can know the good, not fully, not with mastery, but with participation, with reverence and recognition. And meaning, because the transcendent is the source of order. It is not random or chaotic. Even suffering and injustice and loss, when seen in the light of the eternal, belongs to a higher harmony we cannot yet comprehend, but that fills reality with purpose. Boethius rediscovers that this is not an abstract system or something to debate. It's something to be oriented toward, something to live in the direction of. And in turning his soul toward the transcendent, he finds that he is not powerless after all. Because the greatest power is not control over the world, it is alignment with that which is beyond the world. Now, he doesn't ascend to heaven or escape his fate, but he does become rooted in eternity. And in that rooting, he finds stillness. He becomes immovable, unshakable. Not because he closes himself off in a detached way, but because he has opened himself to the only thing that cannot be taken. And so Lady Philosophy restores his vision. And through that vision, Boethius rediscovers who he is. Not a Roman official or a victim of betrayal, but a soul in the image of the transcendent. Of course, so are we. Because as much as the Consolation of Philosophy is a work of late antiquity, its warning is directed at us. Boethius lived through the collapse of Rome's inner order, but we are living through the collapse of something even more fundamental. Not just a culture or a tradition, but our very capacity to recognize that there is something beyond the world at all. We've not merely denied the transcendent, we've forgotten what the term actually means. We don't even know how to ask the questions anymore. We've replaced the sacred with the psychological, the meaningful with the functional, the eternal with the marketable. We reduce love to neurochemistry. We reduce thought to brain waves. We reduce the soul to identity. And we call that realism. But this reduction, and the false sense of control it gives us, has a steep cost. And we are living that cost right now. When the transcendent is forgotten, the world becomes flat. Time becomes a treadmill. People become means to an end. The soul becomes a glitch to be corrected with algorithms and pills or productivity hacks. And when the sacred is silenced, suffering becomes unbearable, because it no longer means anything. It is no longer part of a greater whole. It is just pain, senseless, empty, and cold. For that matter, joy becomes meaningless too. And so what happens? We spiral. As individuals, we sink into anxiety, depression, addiction, and burnout. And as a society, we become tribal, reactive, and obsessed with power. As a planet, we treat nature not as sacred, but as a resource to plunder. Our technologies, which could have connected us to higher things, instead turn us into consumers of endless noise. We are drowning in information and starving for wisdom. We are surrounded by images, but we don't know how to see. This is what happens when we sever our connection to the transcendent. And here is the miracle of Boethius. He writes from a world already collapsing, from inside his own personal loss. But instead of turning to despair or revenge or ideology, he turns inward and upward. And there, in the silence, he rediscovers the absolute, that which does not change, cannot lie, and holds all things in itself. This is not just his consolation, it is ours. Because the transcendent is not gone. It has simply been forgotten and covered over. We have ignored it, but it is waiting, not above us in some unreachable sky, but within, beneath the layers of noise and the fear, beneath the ego and the scrolling and the algorithms and the opinions. It is still there, waiting for us to remember. Because without it, nothing holds. Morality becomes relative, beauty becomes branding, identity becomes idiosyncrasy, justice becomes power, and the soul becomes irrelevant. But with the transcendent, everything comes back into alignment. When we remember it, when we live from it, we begin to see again. We begin to trust again. We begin to suffer with meaning, to love with depth, to think with clarity, and to act with courage. Not because we have all the answers, but because we are once more grounded in that which transcends all the questions. That's why this matters, and why the Consolation of Philosophy is a pathway back to the real. So what then is the fruit of this journey? What comes from remembering the transcendent? In Boethius, we witness something extraordinary. By the end of the Consolation of Philosophy, he is not set free. His circumstances do not change. His enemies are not brought to justice. He is still imprisoned, still condemned, still human, but he is no longer shaken. Because something has shifted in the depths of his soul. He has remembered that who he is cannot be reduced to what happens to him. That the self, the true self, is not the bundle of experiences, identities, or social roles that can be stripped away, but the innermost flame of awareness that remains untouched by fortune or failure or fate. Lady Philosophy has returned him to the center. Not the center of external circumstance or materiality, but the center of being. And in that still point, he finds something the world cannot give and cannot take away. Peace. But not just any peace. Not a fragile equilibrium. Not a moment of numbness between storms. Nor a shallow optimism that says everything will be okay in a kind of toxic positivity. What Boethius finds is what the Christian mystics later called the peace that passes understanding. A peace that does not depend on outcomes, that is not tied to pleasure or success, and that exists even in the face of suffering and death. Because it's not rooted in this world, it's rooted in the transcendent. And this is the great paradox of the soul. When we release our grip on the impermanent, we find the eternal. When we cease demanding that life be fair, we discover that life is meaningful. When we stop asking the world to save us, we remember that the divine has already taken root within us. And that's where Boethius now stands. He has realigned his inner being with the structure of ultimate reality, the good itself. He no longer identifies with the rising and falling of fortune's wheel. He has planted himself in the stillness at the center. He has remembered that true happiness is not pleasure, power, or prestige. It is the soul's participation in the divine. It is the harmony between the human and the eternal. It's the awareness that we were made for more than this material experience, even as we live fully within it. And when that harmony is restored, when the soul remembers its origin, its nature, and its end, then all the noise of the world begins to fade. The world is not silenced, of course, but we have found something deeper than its material sounds. And this is the invitation for us today. You don't need to be in a monastery, and you don't need to leave your life behind. You don't need to wait for the world to become just or fair or wise. You only need to turn inward and upward, to make contact with that quiet, radiant awareness that has never been separate from the source, the part of you that is always aligned with the transcendent. And when you do, you may find that you don't need all the answers, because the peace that passes understanding is not a conclusion. It is a presence. It's the echo of eternity in the soul. And it is available now, always, and in this very moment, just like it was for Boethius. So where does this leave us? What do we do with the wisdom Boethius has offered, not just as a concept, but as a way of being? The answer is both simple and sacred. We must return to the transcendent. Not merely believe in it in the propositional sense, not just discuss it, but actually orient our lives around it. We must root our minds, our actions, our hearts, and our spiritual vision in the reality that there is something greater than time, greater than ideology, greater than the endless struggle of this world's dual opposites. That there is a still point beyond the chaos and a unity that contains all things. This is our task today. Not to escape the world, but to transfigure our lives by remembering what is more than the world. Because once you truly reconnect to the transcendent, something extraordinary happens. The polarities that once consumed you, light and dark, good and evil, left and right, masculine and feminine, sacred and profane, well, they don't vanish. You still discern the difference between them. But now you hold that discernment in the light of something higher. You begin to see that each pole is a reflection, a fragment, a partial, faceted expression of an infinite whole. And your desire for one pole to win, to dominate, to silence, to defeat the other, fades. Not because you've lost clarity, but rather because your desire to express unconditional love and unity to both poles now exceeds your desire to see either one triumph. You start to move from either or to both and, to the beyond. Your identity transcends the egoic attachment to one or the other, and you identify as the transcendent that unifies both poles in the same unity. The soul rises to a place where that unity does not mean sameness, but reconciliation without erasure. You don't live at the level of reaction. You live at the level of radiance. You become a vessel through which the eternal expresses itself, not by taking sides, but by revealing the sacred ground that underlies all sides. But this is not relativism in the physicalist or materialist sense. It's also not indifference. Rather, it's the vision of the mystics. This is what the ancients meant when they said that God is not the sum of opposites, but the collapse of duality into a higher order. And when you begin to live from that place, not just glimpsing it in meditation, but actually rooting your choices, your speech, your relationships, your work, you become like Boethius, unshakable. Because now you're no longer trying to win the game. You're playing from the stillness at the center of the wheel. You're not tossed about by the culture wars or the ego games or cravings for validation. You have already remembered what you are, a being made for the transcendent, rooted in the good, alive in the unity that contains all things. This is what Lady Philosophy reawakens. Remembrance in the deepest sense of the soul. And if we are to walk forward through the chaos of our century, through the unraveling of old systems, through the ecological and spiritual storm, we must become vessels of that remembrance. We must become like her, clear-eyed, grounded, compassionate, unafraid, speaking not to win arguments, but to restore. We don't live for the next trend, but for the eternal flame that never goes out, and showing by our very presence that peace is possible. Not because the world has calmed down, but because we are grounded in that which no storm can touch. This is the task. This is the invitation. This is the rising of your soul. Thank you very much for joining me for this final lecture in the series on Boethius, or perhaps if it's the first lecture that you've listened to on this channel about Boethius, I invite you to check out the entire series of lectures on the Consolation of Philosophy. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you are new. Even though it's free, your subscription really does help this community grow and learn together. Like this video if you enjoyed it, and hit the bell icon to get notified when the next video drops. As always, thank you, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.